The river lay flat and colorless under the pale gray of an early northern dawn, its surface broken only by the slow, disciplined movement of long, narrow hulls sliding forward without a single splash. The oars did not rise and fall in rhythm the way southern fleets rowed. They dipped shallow and smooth, designed not for speed but for silence. The Norsemen understood that the first weapon in any raid was not iron or fire, but surprise, and in the fog drifting off the water that morning, surprise was already theirs. On the eastern bank stood the monastery of Lindisfarne's lesser daughter, a small stone outpost that had been built not for defense but for devotion. Its walls were thin, its gates decorative. It had never needed to repel anything more threatening than a starving traveler or a drunken fisherman. Within its chapel, monks knelt in rows, their voices rising and low. Steady prayer as candles flickered against hand-painted saints on damp plaster. They had no sentries. They had no weapons. Their world was one of routine, ritual, and faith in divine protection. The first Viking to step onto the shore did not run. He did not shout. He walked forward, axe low, eyes fixed on the buildings beyond the trees. He was followed by others, spaced deliberately, not clumped. Their mail shirts were dull and dark, blackened with oil to avoid reflecting light. Leather straps creaked softly as they moved. These men had crossed the North Sea not in search of glory in a single fight, but in pursuit of something far more valuable, a reputation that would travel ahead of them. The chapel doors were kicked inward with a crack of splitting wood. Screams replaced prayer in an instant. Iron met flesh. Torches fell into straw. A young monk, no older than 20, stumbled backward, blood already slick on the stones beneath his bare feet as men he had lived beside for years were cut down in seconds. One of the Norse raiders grabbed a priest by the collar and drove a blade under his ribs, then stepped over a collapsing body without a second glance. The young monk ran. He did not know where he was going. He did not even understand why he was still alive. He only knew that he had to move, driven by animal panic through smoke and fire until he collapsed behind a shattered altar in the far corner of the chapel. His breath came in broken gasps. Through the haze, he saw boots approaching, iron-shod and splashed with blood. The Viking who found him did not raise his axe. For a long moment, the Norseman simply looked down at him. The monk expected death. Instead, the warrior turned his head slightly, as if listening to something that only he could hear, then took a step back. Another step, then he walked away. The monastery burned. The young monk lived. He would spend the rest of his life carrying what he had seen. That moment, one spared life among dozens taken, was not mercy. It was doctrine. By the late 8th century, the Scandinavian world was under pressure. Population growth had outstripped arable land. Clan rivalries had turned violent. Young warriors with no inheritance and no farm to call their own were left with two options: fight their neighbors or go abroad. The sea became their road. Their ships, light and shallow-drafted, allowed them to strike almost anywhere a river met the ocean. And what they found along those waterways were unguarded concentrations of wealth, unlike anything in their homelands. Monasteries were not just places of worship. They were treasuries. They held silver chalices, gold reliquaries, jeweled gospel books, and stored tithes and coin. More importantly, they were undefended. Christian doctrine forbade monks from bearing arms. Their sanctity was supposed to be their shield. The Vikings quickly learned how fragile that shield was. Early raids were brutal but chaotic. Small war bands would storm ashore, kill anyone who resisted, grab what they could carry, and retreat before local lords could muster forces. It worked at first, but word of the attack spread. Coastal communities began to organize. Monasteries hired guards. River towns built wooden palisades. Even poorly trained militias could overwhelm a few dozen raiders once the element of surprise was gone. The Norse solution was not to fight harder. It was to be feared more. They understood something that later empires would formalize but few early medieval armies ever grasped. Morale is to reign. Break it, and even strong walls become meaningless. A dead man ends a threat. A terrified survivor multiplies it. So the Vikings began to spare carefully chosen witnesses. They were not random. Raiders would leave behind monks who were young enough to travel, old enough to be believed and visibly damaged by what they had seen. A burned hand, a missing ear, a scar carved deliberately across the face. These men were allowed to flee, to reach other monasteries, other towns, other ports. And they talked. They described axes splitting skulls in prayer halls. They described altars smashed, relics looted, libraries thrown into fire. They described brothers dragged away in chains toward ships that vanished into the fog. They told of Norse warriors who laughed as holy ground burned. Most importantly, they told of how fast it happened. No warning, no chance to fight, no time to escape. Within months, the fear spread inland faster than any longship could travel by sea. Church bells rang at shadows. Coastal villages emptied. Monasteries abandoned their treasures and fled into the countryside, sometimes even dismantling their own buildings to prevent them from being used as targets. The Viking captains watched this from across the water and understood that their true victories were not measured in silver taken, but in resistance never offered. By the time a longship appeared on the horizon, half the battle was already won. This strategy did not require large armies. It required consistency. Every raid reinforced the stories. Every spared witness became another carrier of terror. In modern terms, it was an information campaign conducted with blades and fire instead of ink. The young monk from Lindisfarne would eventually reach a larger abbey days later, half-starved and trembling. He collapsed at the gates, clutching nothing but a broken cross and his own ruined memories. When he spoke, dozens listened. When dozens repeated it, hundreds believed. When hundreds believed, thousands fled. The Vikings never had to chase them. By the time the next fleet set sail, the land ahead of them was already preparing to surrender. By the time the Norse ships returned to the eastern shores of England the following season, the coastline no longer felt like enemy territory. Smoke from abandoned hearths drifted over empty villages. Cattle wandered untended in fields where no farmers dared to remain. The silence itself was a weapon now, created not by occupation but by expectation. The people did not wait to see if the raiders would strike. They ran because they were certain they would. Viking commanders took note of this change. Men like Rafn Ketilsson, a sea king whose reputation was already spreading along the North Sea, did not need scouts to tell him which settlements were weak. He watched the rivers. If no boats came out to challenge him, if no signal fires rose from the hills, then fear had already arrived before him. That was where he would land. In those places, the Norsemen did not have to fight at all. They walked ashore, took what had been left behind, and burned what remained so that no one would doubt who had been there. The physical destruction mattered less than the story it would create. A blackened church could be rebuilt. The memory of how easily it had fallen would not be. In the monasteries farther inland, abbots gathered their brothers and argued late into the night. Some demanded they arm themselves despite church law. Others insisted that violence would only bring more destruction. Most of them were trapped between doctrine and survival. They had no professional soldiers. Even if they had weapons, few among them knew how to use them. What they did have were messengers, men who had seen the raiders and lived. Those men became the most powerful figures in Christian Europe for a brief, terrible time. They walked from abbey to abbey describing the same scenes with the same haunted eyes. Their accounts were not exaggerated. If anything, they were restrained, because no words could fully capture the speed and brutality of the attacks. They spoke of how the Vikings did not fight in neat lines. They moved in small groups, slipping through gaps, striking individuals instead of formations. A monk who raised a staff would be cut down before he could swing it. A guard who hesitated would be surrounded and dragged to ground. There was no front line. There was only chaos. As these stories accumulated, something deeper than fear took hold, a sense of inevitability. People stopped asking whether the Vikings would come and began asking when. That shift was exactly what the Norse captains wanted. An enemy who expects defeat is already defeated. By the early 9th century, the psychological campaign had become refined. Raiders no longer killed everyone they encountered. They selected. Strong men who might resist were eliminated. The weak, the injured, the visibly traumatized were allowed to flee. Sometimes they were even given food for the road. ensuring that they would survive long enough to spread their tales. It was not kindness. It was logistics. Each survivor was a walking broadcast of Viking dominance. In one recorded case, a monastery on the Irish coast sent its valuables away weeks before a single Norse sail was sighted, based entirely on the arrival of two burned, half-blind monks from another abbey. When the Vikings finally landed, they found almost nothing of material value, but they burned the place anyway, because the message was more important than the loot. Ralph and Kettleson's fleet arrived there next, not to plunder, but to demonstrate. His men marched through the ruins in full armor, letting locals watch from hiding places. They raised no shields. They faced no resistance. Their presence alone was enough. This was warfare without battle. Yet not every place surrendered. Some lords tried to fight back, rallying peasant levies and church militias around wooden fortifications. These were the moments when Viking doctrine was truly tested. If fear failed, steel would finish the job. When the Norse encountered resistance, they attacked it brutally and publicly. Defenders were executed in front of survivors. Captured leaders were killed in ways designed to be remembered, not because the Vikings were sadists, though some were, but because terror required reinforcement. A single successful defense could unravel months of psychological preparation, so they made examples. One such stand occurred near a fortified abbey on the coast of Northumbria. A local lord had assembled nearly 200 men, far more than the raiding party that approached. But the defenders had heard the stories. They had seen the survivors. Their lines were already brittle when the Norse advanced. The Vikings did not charge. They formed a shield wall and moved forward slowly, axes resting on their rims. They beat their shield with their weapons, creating a deep, rhythmic thunder that rolled across the field. It was not meant to intimidate trained soldiers. It was meant to trigger the memories of every story the defenders had heard. Some men dropped their spears and ran before contact was ever made. When the lines finally collided, the outcome was inevitable. The Viking formation held. The militia collapsed. Those who fled were allowed to go. Once again, witnesses were released. Within weeks, the tale of that defeat was spreading through every coastal parish. It did not matter that the defenders had outnumbered the raiders. What mattered was that they had still lost. The lesson was clear. Numbers did not protect you. By now, even hardened warriors began to believe it. The Vikings had achieved what every military force in history seeks, but few ever accomplish. They had turned reputation into a weapon as real as any sword. Their enemies fought ghosts before they ever faced men, and those ghosts were carried by monks who could not forget what they had seen. The fear that now gripped Northern Europe did not fade. It deepened, evolving from panic into something colder and more dangerous: resignation. Communities no longer asked how to stop the Norse raids. They asked how to survive them. Some hid their treasures. Some paid tribute. Some abandoned entire regions. All of these responses were victory for the Vikings, because each one meant less resistance when their ships finally appeared. By the middle of the 9th century, Viking fleets were no longer just raiding forces. They were moving populations. Wherever their reputation went first, the land emptied behind it. When their sails came into view, they did not find armies waiting. They found open gates and silent streets. In Frankish territory along the Seine, entire religious orders evacuated their abbeys weeks before a single Norse vessel was spotted, guided by the testimony of monks who had escaped earlier attacks in Britain. These men had become carriers of a living memory, and their words were trusted more than any fortification. Stone walls could be breached. Fear could not. Viking leaders understood this and exploited it with precision. They began to coordinate raids not only geographically, but narratively. Attacks were spaced so that survivors from one region would arrive in the next just ahead of the ships. The timing was deliberate. By the time panic had peaked, the longships would already be on the horizon. This was not chaos. It was operational design. A single raid might kill 100 people, but a story could move 10,000. One of the most telling moments came during a major expedition into eastern England. A coalition of monasteries had pooled their resources and hired mercenaries, hoping to finally stand their ground. They built barricades and dug trenches, convinced that if they could just hold long enough, the Vikings would retreat. 2 days before the Norse fleet arrived, A monk stumbled into their camp. His face was scarred. His voice shook. He spoke of another abbey that had tried the same thing and been wiped out in hours. He described men being flanked, gates being forced, and defenders begging for mercy that never came. The coalition broke apart that night. By dawn, half the defenders were gone. When the Vikings landed, they encountered little more than a symbolic resistance. Once again, terror had done the work of an army. This method did not make the Vikings invincible. Eventually, organized kingdoms like Wessex would adapt. They would build permanent fortifications, maintain standing forces, and learn to fight back. But for nearly a century, Norse psychological warfare gave small raiding bands an advantage no numbers could match. And the monks, the unwilling messengers, were at the center of it all. History rarely remembers them. Their names are lost. Their voices are silent now. But in their time, they reshaped the political map of Europe, not through diplomacy, not through conquest, but through memory. Every time a burned survivor crossed the countryside telling of axes and chapels and fire on holy ground, he extended Viking power far beyond the reach of any longship. He turned rumor into strategy, trauma into a weapon. The Vikings did not need to be everywhere. They only needed to be believed. That is a forgotten truth behind their dominance. Not just that they were fierce warriors, but that they mastered something far more powerful. The human mind's instinct to flee from what it cannot stop. Steel breaks bodies. Fear breaks civilizations.